women in history, women's history, American history, women in literature, and African American art. Gee's Bend have been working on research projects, and 15 students are going to present their projects today. Just wanted to say a couple of introductory remarks about Gee's Bend for those of you who are not in the classes. Gee's Bend is a rural and quite isolated community in Alabama. You can see here on the map, it's located on a piece of land that is surrounded on three sides by a bend in the Alabama River, and that sort of geographical isolation is accounted for by that. It is also a community that has had a long-standing tradition of quilt making that extends back well into the 19th century. All the residents of Gee's Bend, practically all of them are African American. They're all descendants of slaves who worked on a plantation there. But despite its isolation, Gee's Bend has sort of come into the public view and gained national attention at different key moments in history. And those are the key moments that the presentations today are going to be looking at. In the 1930s, the government, during the Depression, intervened at Gee's Bend. It was as the most in the most poor county in the United States, and so the government came in to give aid and also to document what was going on there, both the situation and also the progress that was being made. And there are a series of photographs made by the Farm Security Administration during that time, and some of those photographs are some of the most famous images we have out of the Depression era. And then in the 1960s, during the Civil Rights era, Martin Luther King visited Gee's Bend. He was very inspired by the people there, and they were inspired by him. Many residents from Gee's Bend went to Camden to register to vote. They marched with Dr. King and the famous march from South to Montgomery. And inspired by him, women also started what's called the Freedom Quilting Bee and began to make quilts commercially and find a new livelihood. And that photograph on the lower right is women from the Freedom Quilting Bee. And then in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the quilts themselves gained national and international fame when they were exhibited in a series of exhibitions. And I'm showing you some quilt makers there. And then finally, the presentations today are also inspired by an exhibition that is coming to Warren Wilson College and the Center for Craft Creativity and Design this September. And the exhibition is called Gee's Bend From Quilts to Prints. And it's a joint exhibition, but it's also a joint education project, and we envision it being a kind of center point of a lot of interdisciplinary learning on our campus, of which today's session is a kind of model for that. And the exhibition really sort of traces what has happened since those initial exhibitions in 2002, 2004, 2006, and follows the work of 4 women who you'll see profiled today and hear about their artwork, who in recent years have gone to a fine arts press in Berkeley, California, and made prints inspired by their quilt making, and really sort of explores their work as artists beyond this initial foray into the art world. And finally, today's presentations will be available to the public as audio labels. So in the fall, when students or people from Asheville and beyond come and visit both our exhibition and the exhibition in downtown Asheville, they'll be able to call up on their cell phone a number and hear the students who are here presented today give their little essays. So without further ado, I'm going to invite the first student. So let me just quickly tell you how the format is going to go. We're going to have a series of presentations from the history course, then a bio and a discussion of the artwork of 2 of the artists, and then 3 more history presentations, and then bio and talk about the artwork from the last 2 quilt makers that we're featuring. And so each person will just come up and read their pieces. Some of the students have actually recorded theirs already, and so those will just play. Hopefully. Okay, thank you.
Students, introduce yourselves as you start talking.
Hi, my name is Alafia Patterson.
Sorry.
That one can go back up. That last
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Hi, my name is Alafia Patterson. I'm going to be talking about the household economy and the dream of land. In the postbellum South, African Americans in rural areas strive to own land and enjoy the economic autonomy and privileges that came along with it. In the pursuit of this aim, they were met with economic and racial oppression. Therefore, African Americans could not achieve consumer status nor be totally self-sufficient. Yet to gain enough capital to purchase land and obtain consumer status, African Americans avoided sharecropping and utilized household economics. Through this, they could gain financial capital while still in the comfort and safety of their homes and communities. The household economy existed as an alternative market in which the labor and goods produced went directly into the hands of the African American family. As one might imagine, the labor of the family members was very crucial to the household economy. The products of the household economy varied frequently, sometimes a basket of berries picked by the children, other times a home garden crop of wheat. The household economy provided a relatively small income through the strategic use of the Southern credit system. This reserve could be multiplied enough to grant the purchase of personal land or other property needed for self-sufficiency. Three major forms of credit existed: annual crop liens, chattel mortgages, and store credit. Crop liens most directly fit the standard image of sharecropping, where a loan would be given to a farmer on the agreement that a certain sum of crops would be his return. This was the last resort of African American farmers, as a number of risks could cause him to default on the loan, especially the personal feelings of the white farmer, which factored very heavily in the terms of the contract. Chattel mortgages gave a bit more flexibility to the African American farmer, where they relied instead on the mortgaging of high-value tools. Mortgaging of a high-value tool would off debt and enable the buying of a farm animal. Store credit was the smallest form of credit, as it purchased store items in exchange for money, goods, or labor. African Americans in the rural South also relied on the African American community to achieve their dreams of land ownership. When a freed slave purchased land, they oftentimes practiced double farming, a system that mirrored tenant farming, but was practiced by African American landholders within their own community. An African American family would live on another African American family's land, making it seem as though they were separate, minuscule pieces of property, and avoiding the wrath of white Southerners over African American prosperity. They were also able to avoid the financial instability land ownership could bring. Land ownership also contributed to African American efforts to create schools and widely educate the population in hopes of advancing their financial and social standings within the community. In the rural late 19th century South, African Americans found ways to achieve their goals of land ownership and consumer status through the support of household economics and their community. African Americans were able to gain land and become one step closer to both the rights of freedom and the economic autonomy that abolition had promised. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Neubauer. I worked with Fern Hoffman and Sharon Ward in our Women in American History class. We studied two texts. Fern and I looked into one ourselves, and Sharon another, focused on life in the Cotton South and also life under Jim Crow laws in the South. This presentation sort of follows the theme of home economy in a way, and I will focus more on that and women's work in cotton fields. After the Civil War and well into the first half of the 20th century, life in the rural South was defined by cotton. King Cotton dominated the lives of rural agricultural workers by dictating their work in the cultivating season and the economy of the home throughout the year. Women living and working on cotton farms in the agricultural South faced a variety of challenges in meeting labor demands as well as cultural expectations of femininity. Many women, and nearly all African American women, worked in the fields alongside their families during the busiest seasons, despite the prevailing opinion that such work was unsuited to women. Not only did the need for extra hands place women in the field, peak harvest times restricted travel and involvement in church or community activities because all resources, human and animal, were required for the production of cotton. Despite these restrictions, women participated in their communities through involvement in churches, social house visits, and kinship networks. Church and community involvement allowed women to give relief to one another from their often harsh living conditions. And kinship networks frequently provided routes out of rural life and into urban environments, especially in the middle of the 20th century and later. These communities remained strongly race segregated and sometimes divided by social standing and wealth. As a result, women surrounded by a community of different ethnicity often remain socially isolated despite physical proximity to others, as in the case of G. Spence. Farm wives and mothers performed the traditionally feminine duties of domestic work, childcare, and home protection. The latter of these three, a contribution of paramount importance in the poverty-stricken and cash-strapped lives of sharecropping families. In the crop lien system, sharecropping families very rarely had access to cash, generally only immediately after the cotton harvest. This made purchasing goods for the home extremely difficult, and simultaneously made women's ability to produce in the home crucial to the survival of their families. One of the most important aspects of farm women's work was their role as a seamstress and mender of clothing. As a part of the larger necessity to waste nothing, women in rural families often produced all of their family's clothes and turned worn and otherwise useless cloth into valuable quilts, very appropriate for G. Spence. By appropriating the material from their husbands' and children's well-worn work clothes and using widely available pattern templates, rural women stitched together patterned quilts, which were often filled with cotton batting from their farm. They did this either on their own or with other groups of women sometime to speed the work. Not only was this work necessary to keeping their families warm in the winter, it also provided an outlet of expression for their creative energies and aesthetic leanings, something very important in a sort of drudgery-filled life otherwise. A woman would need to force her quilting time into finite portions of her day when she was not cooking, cleaning the house, or doing the wash. The conclusion, non-existent. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ellie Medley, and my group with Becca Drost and Cobra Stanley, we did a presentation on race and the rural Great Depression. Black women were neglected by society at large, and this influenced them to create strong kin network relationships. One quote from the book was, "You don't need no certain somebody, you need somebody." Family life provided a strong support system for Black women. They depended on each other and they supported each other, and this empowered them and gave them strength when it was most needed. There is nothing, no ownership or just for power that stands between us and our kin. This was a Black strategy for survival. They had a different scale of values than their white counterparts. The death of old folk lives, an acceptance of a death that enabled us to cross class and racial lines, a death that made us free. Black women became strong in their minds and culture as they denied, discriminated against by the rest of the country. Black women who were doing domestic work saw Black workers in other factories as a threat on their money intake. They started a competition for jobs that led to Black factory workers being known as better class Blacks and better at keeping their jobs. However, families of all races produced as much of their family's food, clothing, and supplies as possible in order to save money and pay off possible debts. They stressed their scarce resources when nothing was being produced and sharing resources with extended family members, much like G. Spence. Another coping mechanism that upcountry women used was new divisions of labor within their households. For African American women, these times were more difficult as these families who did not own their own land
or were in debt did not have as much luck in finding homes as whites due to racism. The work Black women would do as long, full days of hefty housework, only to be paid barely enough to sustain their own lives and lives of their families. What they did bring back, they contributed to the benefit of the family, and this represented a labor of love. Black families cooked for each other and shared what they would with each other. It brought a friendly competition and a bonding community to share food together.
Hey everybody, I'm Devin. I worked with Joey and Kim on African American women's farming and teaching opportunities in the South during the Great Depression. Amongst the racism and prejudice of the South in the early 1900s, Black and white women made strides to educate African American farmers on how to produce crops more efficiently. The United States Department of Agriculture employed both Black and white agents who attempted to educate and provide relief for poor African American communities. Agents overcame poor funding, racism, lack of governmental support, and more in their efforts to educate these African American women. Although odds were stacked high against both teachers and farmers, African American women were able to advance themselves one small victory at a time on the path to self-sufficiency. One such victory was made through chicken farming. Before women realized how lucrative chicken farming could be, most gathered up excess produce or products and sold or traded them for the things that they needed. If they weren't able to produce enough or simply needed more money, they would pick berries and sell them by the quart or gallon. Once chicken farming became a lucrative business in the South, many women jumped on board. As chicken farming developed as a business, it quickly became scientific and organized. They chose which practices they wanted to implement and traded information with each other via a monthly publication that was shipped and available throughout the South. In most cases, the women who taught Black farmers were African American women themselves. They recognized that the work that they were doing was more important than any other job. The women being taught also found more than just practical value in the lessons that they were learning. The information that these women received and the bonds they forged by working together helped them survive in a world that often seemed inhospitable. However, the support of working class groups often came from bourgeois middle class people who could never truly understand the struggle of making ends meet on a daily basis. While most of society was attempting to explain that women were not fit for political or social opinion, it's important to acknowledge that the mothers of the Scottsboro Boys fought harder than most of their contemporaries. Although women were supposed to be docile, their story clearly shows how active women could be. Because the mothers of the Scottsboro Boys were involved in the Communist Party, they were awarded opportunities for public speaking that they had never had before. Ada Wright, one of the mothers of the Scottsboro Boys, participated in a 6-month lecture series in Europe sponsored by the International Red Aid. Wright was able to speak about the inequalities still existent in the United States and the need to eradicate racism and mobilize against the systematic oppression that was and still is present in the United States. The independence and perseverance of African American women in the South, as demonstrated through their learned skills of farming, chicken farming, and public speaking, enabled them to overcome some of the methods of discrimination and oppression by teaching one another and the world about their struggle.
Raise your hand.
Maria had one of another change in hard work. From sunup to sundown, January to September, year after year, Maria worked tirelessly in the field, giving her little energy to piece together quotes and evening. Even as a child, she had very little spare time. In addition to working in the local cotton field every day, she also did animal chores and picked blackberries with her grandmother to help cross the river. Kathleen was handicapped, which added another obligation to her always strenuous wisdom in life. Loretta went to school as a child, only when her work in the field allowed it. She had to help support her family and earn money. Despite being one of our children to December, and she was able to attend school occasionally during that time. But then it was back to work for the rest of the year, where she received very little formal education. Most of what she learned was from older family members and neighbors. She didn't want to sew at first because she didn't appreciate the art, possibly due to her mother spending her family in pet-raised childhood along with her. Her young life was chaotic, dealing with her various family members, although she claimed she at least got along with her stepmother. They ended up bearing 7 children with the abusive man she married. He controlled her financially as well as with violence until she was much older and gained independence. Nevertheless, she made the best of her work, just as she made the best of the non-work clothes she incorporated into her clothes. Loretta's entry into clothing, like most clothers of Jews then, came not so much from formal training as it did tradition. Although there were many seemingly more pressing demands placed upon her from a very young age, Loretta was taught to sew by her grandmother, who recognized that the craft was inherent to their lifestyle as a necessity. From cutting fabric and threading needles to arranging fabric compositions, she learned how to quilt through assisting her grandmother with projects. Drawing from traditional patterns and techniques shared within the community, as well as gathering quilting materials from scrap quilting and fabric, Petway slowly broke into quilting, creating patterns to fit the established traditions of Jews then, such as the very quilts on display now. While her materials hadn't always been of the utmost quality, all of her work there to find the previous life of the materials brought together to form her clothes.
I'm Katie Burns, and I'll be speaking about Loretta Petway's work clothes quilts and one of her prints. Loretta Petway is a descendant of slaves who worked the cotton fields of Gee's Bend, Alabama. Her quilts, the oldest in the exhibit, connect us to Gee's Bend quilt traditions. The exhibit will feature 2 of Loretta's quilts and 1 of her prints. These quilts were originally made from the only fabric that was available and affordable, scraps of old clothing. Traditional designs include housetop and lazy gal or bars quilts. Loretta's quilts and prints reflect these traditions. Her fabrics are sturdy with faded colors. Her quilts were originally made with a single purpose in mind, to keep her family warm. She preferred heavy fabrics for their warmth and durability. As she explained, I made all of my quilts out of old shirts and dress tails and breeches legs. I could never get no good fabric to make quilts, so I had to get the best of the old clothes my peoples wore. Loretta is a master of the work clothes quilt. As you see in this slide, this is a very simple housetop and strip quilt design. Her quilts symbolize long hours of labor, both by the person who worked in the fields originally wearing the clothes and by Loretta herself, as she designed and pieced the fabric together. These quilts have special meaning to many Gee's Bend women. They believe a work clothes quilt encompasses memories and the spirit of the person who had originally worn the clothing. The 2-sided work clothes quilt is a very simple housetop design. It is made of fabrics including cotton, denim, twill, corduroy, and wool. In this 2-sided quilt, rectangular pieces of fabric with stains, dirt, and fading colors were sewn both vertically and horizontally to create the quilt design. The well-worn fabric reminds us of the hard life experienced by Gee's Bend residents. Loretta's bars work clothes quilt was made in the 1970s from cotton, denim, and pant-like fabric. By the 1960s, many Gee's Bend quilters were employed by the Freedom Quilting Bee, a cooperative where women made and sold quilts, earning income to support their families. Most women had begun to use newer textiles, such as corduroy, that were made available from department stores to make quilts for commercial sale. Loretta was not allowed to join the cooperative. Her quilts were considered too primitive, raw, and rough. She preferred to stick to her work clothes fabrics. Loretta's quilts are distinctive. They are not neatly sewn, but this is what makes them powerful. Using bars or long vertical strips of cloth was believed to be the most efficient way to construct a quilt from fabric remnants. These are three of Loretta Petway's prints that she made at Paulson Press in California, and I'll be speaking about Lazy Gal, which is on the right. Lazy Gal is an etching Loretta Petway made in 2007 to achieve the look of faded denim on paper. An impression of the fabric maquette is made on a wax-coated plate that is treated with spit bite, which is an acid that gives the surface its faded appearance. Lazy Gal was the name given to strip quilts made from long, vertical pieces of fabric. They were considered a lazy way to make quilts since intricate cutting and piecing together was not needed. Loretta's prints appear to be made from scraps of denim imperfectly sewn together with uneven and unfinished edges. Printmaking allows a larger audience of people to see the powerful message the women of G-Spend incorporate into their quilt designs, connecting the viewer to the hardships endured by living in rural Alabama, yet also the beauty that could be created with the imaginative use of pieces of fabric.
Loretta Bennett was born on December 29, 1960 in G-Spend, Alabama. As a child, she worked in the fields, picking cotton and harvesting vegetables. When she was 8, she was expected to harvest around 100 pounds of cotton every day. Despite these circumstances, Loretta managed to complete her education, even though she had to take a bus for about 2 hours each day to get to and from school. She graduated and married her high school sweetheart, Lovett Bennett. Her husband joined the military and they both moved to Germany for his post. During the next several years, Loretta began to quilt as the two of them moved back and forth between the United States and Germany. As a child, she helped out the women in her family by piecing together quilts. It was a part of life for her. When she visited her aunt, they would always sew before they could play. In high school, her home economics class was assigned a quilting project. One of the teachers was having a baby, so they were supposed to make a baby quilt. Loretta was given the task of quilting the finished product. She kept that baby quilt pattern and made several other quilts based on it in later years. During her husband's first post in Germany, Loretta made a dress and flower plate applique quilt and learned how to knit. It was very cold in Germany, and other army wives noticed the quilts that Loretta had brought with her from her mother. Loretta was still primarily making baby quilts, so she asked her mother to send more full-sized quilts. Loretta sold many of these quilts to the German women. After moving back to the United States, Loretta went back to school to become an OBGYN. This career was short-lived because she and her husband moved back to Germany again, and she had a second child. Eventually, they did move back to the United States permanently. When Loretta went back to attend funerals in G-Spend, she found out that the tradition of quilting was fading. She decided to apply for a fellowship grant from the Alabama State Council on the Arts so that her mother could teach her the fine art and every small detail of quilting. Around this time, she attended a museum opening for the quilters of G-Spend in Houston, Texas. When she looked at the quilts, she did not think she could ever produce a quilt that would be good enough to show in a museum. Over the next several months, she heard about the success of the quilt exhibitions, but did not attempt to make any herself. She then realized that her mother and grandmother had laid the foundations for quilters, and she only needed to, in her own words, thread her own needle and piece a quilt together. Loretta Bennett designs her own quilts. She usually sketches them out first in a composition book, and then uses crayons to fill in the color. She used to buy material from fabric stores, but now mostly goes to thrift shops. She considers the cloth she gets from thrift stores better than new fabric because it is hardy and lasts longer. For Loretta, fabric hunting is a fun part of her process. In terms of continuing her artistic career, Loretta says she would like to learn how to paint because she thinks that if she did, her paintings would look like her quilts.
Hi, I'm Allison, and I'm going to be talking to you all about Loretta Bennett as an artist.
Loretta Bennett is one of the youngest of the Gee's Bend quilters, known as a spring chicken. The exhibition in September will represent 2 of her quilts and 4 of her prints. Loretta's quilts and prints are a little different from other Gee's Bend quilts because she was part of a generation where she was barely making quilts to keep her family warm since she lived with central heating. She instead was making quilts more because it was a tradition and because she needed a way to artistically express herself. Because of this, she had the ability to put a spin on the artistic qualities of her quilts. She's known for taking standard quilt designs and further abstracting the Gee's Bend quilt designs into compositions that are radical, spare, and unique. Loretta gets a lot of her inspiration for her quilts and prints from her travels. Her husband was in the military, so unlike many of the other Gee's Bend women, she spent a lot of her young married years traveling and even lived in Germany for a period of time. In relation to her travels, Loretta states, "In the southwestern U.S., houses and cars were often very bright, bold colors. Overseas, brilliant colors were apparent in flowers and festival clothing, hinting that much of her inspiration comes from her worldly experiences." This quilt that you're looking at is titled Aquarium, and she produced it in 2008. Inspiration from her travels can be seen in this quilt, and it shows the bright colors that you would see in festivals, in contrast with the deep purples. This print, titled Yellow Jack, produced in 2006, has clear inspiration from nature, but also shows the colors of countries in Europe. She actually made this for the Art in the U.S. Embassy's program. Looking at Loretta's quilts, her vibrant colors and change in shapes dance across almost all of them. Loretta is quoted as saying, "I'm a little bolder, even though I'm quiet," in reference to her use of vibrant colors, but dislike of using different textures. In this print titled in this print titled Forever for Old Lady Sally, it is clear that she liked to use a lot of different colors. When looking for inspiration, Loretta says she gets her designs from a couple of different ways, some from the fabric first. She doesn't like to mix textures and prefers used clothes, but when she is inspired by fabric, she likes to first sketch out her ideas. This separates Loretta a lot from other quilters who mostly just freehand their quilts. Today, most of Loretta's materials come from thrift stores because it is used in older cloth, which she refers to as real compared to the cloth that is produced today. Right now, you are looking at an image of her planning out a maquette, the fabric pieces, like quilt tops the women would make for the printing process at Pulse and Press. Now, she is not just sketching out a piece in this image, but she is planning it out in the same way that you would with a sketch. This is different compared to the other quilters who would just grab a piece of cloth and sew it right onto the quilt at the sewing machine. Loretta Bennett is taking the traditional patterns of housetops that the older quilters created and turning them into a new piece by jumbling up the designs to create something different. If you look at this untitled quilt she produced in 2008, you can see the clear resemblance to the traditional housetop, but she mixed it up and made it her own. When Loretta quilts, she likes to turn on music and dance. This is clear in her use of color and shapes. Bill Arnett shares a quote from Loretta stating, "I quilt with music. If there's a good song on, I stop and dance, because that runs in my family. And that's what gets me going. I just let it happen. I like to lay my pieces out. I like to get a good color first, and good music." And Loretta goes to work. This print, titled No Way, No Way, produced in 2007, shows how Loretta becomes inspired by the music she listens to. Splashes of bright color, and the randomization of shapes almost exemplify a dance across the print. The rhythm of changing color and the improvisation clear in this quilt exemplifies her love for music. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Zoe, and I worked with Rose and Kyle on women in the civil rights and Black Power movements. A common misconception surrounding the civil rights and Black Power movements is that the women of these movements were wholly behind the scenes and were not as passionate or involved with civil rights as the male leaders. Rosa Parks is remembered for being a tired passenger whose refusal to give up her seat launched a citywide bus boycott, but her true role in the civil rights movement goes much deeper than that. Her legacy is one of inaction, but she was very much aware of the active role she was playing. However, Rosa Parks was just one of many female leaders in the civil rights movement whose actions were essential in cementing its success, but whose roles were pushed to the periphery of history because of their gender. Septima P. Clark was a teacher whose grassroots actions helped build the civil rights and Black Power movements throughout the South during the 1950s and 1960s. Her biggest accomplishment lies in the creation of the Citizenship School, which promoted literacy among uneducated Southern African Americans and offered them avenues to enfranchisement. Charlene Hunter Galt was the first African American woman to attend University of Virginia. She graduated high school top of her class and was chosen by the NAACP to test the separate but equal law. She would eventually be accepted, only to have to leave her first night because of racial violence. Despite adversity, Galt went on to graduate from the University of Virginia. Fannie Lou Hamer was an influential and charismatic orator whose personal anecdotes of racism and injustice helped make the abstract ideas of the civil rights movement more real and accessible to large groups of people. In 1964, Hamer spoke at a hearing at the National Theater in Washington, D.C., sharing her testimonies of mistreatment of herself to other activists. The coverage of Hamer's story drew national attention to the inequalities suffered by Black Mississippians for the first time. These women, and many, many more, played pivotal roles in the fight for racial equality throughout the country. The administrative and organizational roles women played allowed them to build grassroots networks and connect to underrepresented communities in the fight for racial justice. The female leaders of the civil rights movement used an arsenal of skills at their disposal to rally their communities, including religion, oration, and social networking. However, once the fight for racial justice became more of a fight and less of a movement surrounding nonviolence, women were no longer valued in the same capacity because fighting and violence were a man's domain. Despite the patriarchal rhetoric of the Black Power movement, militant Black female leaders emerged, fighting to end the racial violence and economic depressions in their communities and throughout the country. These women, though oftentimes left out of the history of the Black Power and Civil Rights movement, overcame obstacles from both external and internal forces in order to fight, protest, and organize for a more equal society.
Hi everyone, I'm Anna and I worked with Iris and Jasmine. And ours is similar to Zoe's, except we're talking about women and more generally. In the South, during the Civil Rights Movement, women played a vital role when it came to activism, although many historians felt it was not important to write down what these women contributed. Historians today, such as Shannon Freistack and Charles Payne, have finally taken the time to tell the stories of women's involvement and highlight their efforts. These women played critical roles in effecting change through contributions to the Congress of Racial Equality, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Religion was used as an important channel by organizations to reach out to community members. It was believed that women possessed a holier spirit. As a result, their communities found them more trustworthy than the male activists. However, reverends also acted as a support system to encourage women's involvement in the movement. Women were the backbone of these organizations. Much of their work was done within the communities and out of the public eye through canvassing, motivating their peers, and housing volunteers. They did the majority of the spade work, which involved outreach, the unglamorous office work, acting as the glue for organizations. Women were more publicly involved through demonstrations, voter registrations, the freedom rides, bus boycotts, sit-ins, and mass meetings. However, there were women who rose towards leadership positions.
Aretha Castle presided over one of CORE's chapters. Laura McGehee instilled courage in community members to register at the polls. And Rosa Keller spoke strongly for integration in organizations because she believed that integration was the only path for a political group to succeed. Specifically, local women were engaged in grassroots efforts, organizing themselves into groups to combat the inequalities. They were also involved in the furthering of the movement's goals. Women volunteers focused on an assigned area, providing a variety of services and engaging members of the community through voter registrations, education, community centers, and medical clinics. Young women played a predominant role through student sit-ins, which reshaped the landscape of the civil rights movement. College students brought new civil rights activists, which were highly beneficial because the younger generation was less constrained by their expected roles, unlike the older women participating in the movement, in turn bringing the issue back to the forefront. What is most powerful is that women face backlash, risking arrest, the potential for physical violence from angry mobs and police brutality. Women continue to persevere and to work to attain justice and equality. Because of their persistence in being the backbone, women were the leaders, not followers, spearheading the movement.
Hello, my name is Sophia, and I worked with Anna and Victoria, and we also read about the Civil Rights Movement. During the Civil Rights Movement, the South served as a hot spot for perpetual racism, sexism, and violence against African Americans. Because of deeply entrenched racial biases, the white populations of many southern states had a hard time adjusting to the ideas and policies of the Civil Rights Movement. This led to a continuation of domination through violence in the forms of sexual assault, property damage, and a general disregard for the humanity of African Americans. Although the Civil Rights Movement is remembered for fighting legislation and segregation laws, when an activist of the time looked back, she reflected, "We were not fighting segregation as much as the abuses of Negroes." Despite years of fighting against slavery and the new struggles created by the South's resistance to change, African American communities persevered, creating grassroots community action organizations. Groups such as MAP South found ways of organizing themselves for positive change without the majority's support. African American communities refused to be quelled by an apathetic government and a racist society. Despite the daily prejudices and threats of physical and psychological abuse, they continued to push forward. The Gee's Bend story provides yet another example of a minority community supporting themselves when the government refused to step in and offer assistance in times of need. By keeping their quilting tradition alive and continuing to pass skills down to younger generations, the citizens of Gee's Bend have effectively proven their resilience, creativity, and cultural value while putting their little town on the map in the process. Originally a small village made up of mostly former slaves, the Gee's Bend's quilting community exists today as an important example of historically marginalized people organizing for positive change through art. The older quilts made by mothers and grandmothers of younger quilt makers tell an amazing story of past struggles. The more recent quilts made by women who were not alive during the Great Depression speak directly to that history in that they use similar patterns but make creative changes that indicate progress. This continuity is important because it is a reminder of the very real and not very distant past that many tend to forget. That is, that during the Depression, as well as during the War on Poverty, predominantly black communities were not afforded aid in the same way that white ones were, making it necessary for those communities to do the work themselves. Though it is indeed depressing to realize that the American government was so apathetic regarding the struggles of some of its most severely impoverished communities, the work that African American organizations did in Memphis, Salem, and Gee's Bend is an inspiring reminder that communities really are powerful when they come together for a common cause. Thank
Mary Lee Bendoff, the seventh of 16 children, was born in 1935 in Gee's Bend, Alabama. Mary Lee grew up working in cotton fields alongside her family. She also attended the local school off and on throughout her childhood until she had a child at age 14, the first of 8. In 1955, she married Reuben Bendoff and added 7 more children to their family. Around the age of 12, she began to create her own quilts, having learned the skills from her mother and other influential community members. In 1965, Bendoff joined other members of the Gee's Bend community and Martin Luther King in a march in Camden, Alabama. After many years of honing her quilt-making skills and personal style, Bendoff gained national notoriety in 1999 after she was the subject of the Los Angeles Times Pulitzer Prize-winning article about the effort to reestablish ferry services across the Alabama River. Mary Lee became enveloped in the quilt-making community at a very young age. Gee's Bend has a rich tradition of creating these works of art. The practice is not only a way for the women of the area to spend time together, but also was born of necessity. Quilts were traditionally created as a means of keeping warm in the winter, especially with the lack of heating in homes. Even as a small child, Mary Lee was around quilts. She and other young girls her age would play beneath the quilts as the adult women would work on them. This served as an introduction to the patterns and styles of the tradition. Mary Lee believes that quilts should be made from used clothing. After her husband's death, Mary Lee took her husband's uniforms and made them into patches, which she then turned into a quilt to commemorate her husband's life and legacy. Quilting has not only been a central part of Bendoff's life and community identity, but has also allowed her experiences that she never before thought possible. For example, Mary Lee has been very pleased in her later years to get to travel extensively. In addition, her success has allowed her to be involved in acts of charity. Quilting is not just a pastime, it is a way of life. Quilting has become a way for these artists to tell their stories. For Mary Lee, this means communicating her approach to love and spirituality. Ms. Bendoff says, "It makes me feel good when I take old clothes and make something beautiful. And old clothes have spirit in them. They also have love. When I make a quilt, that's what I want it to have too. The love and the spirit of the clothes and the people who wore it. When I make the quilt, it has that love and spirit."
Hi, I'm Savannah, and I'll be talking about Mary Lee and her use of acknowledging her predecessors and her quilting and her titling her quilts and prints. Mary Lee Bendoff is a cherished Gee's Bend elder, an innovative quilt maker, and a keeper of Gee's Bend's history and traditions. Like all women in Gee's Bend, Mary Lee learned the techniques and aesthetics of quilt making as a child from her grandmother, mother, aunts, and other women of the community. Here's an example of 3 generations of block quilts. The first one is made by her mother, Ellen Mosley, in 1955. The second is made by Mary Lee in 1985, and the third is made by Mary Lee's eldest daughter, Essie Bendoff Betway, in 1973. Due to the lineage of quilt making through the generations, an emphasis on family connections and the passing down of knowledge has allowed the Gee's Bend quilting traditions to be kept alive for over 100 years. In Gee's Bend, the craftsmanship of making quilts has been passed down from generation to generation, improving, adapting, and evolving over time, resulting in the distinctive quilts and prints exhibited in museums and galleries all over the world. Here's an example of one of the quilts that we'll be showing in our exhibit in September, and the use of Mary Lee's materials. In her quilts, Mary Lee honors her family members and community by using fabrics that have been previously owned and worn by others. According to the artist, it makes me feel good when I take old clothes and make something beautiful. And old clothes have spirit in them. They also have love. When I make a quilt, that's what I want it to have too, the love and spirit of the clothes and the people who wore it. Although Gee's Bend quilts clearly have lots of meaning to the women who make them and the people who use and see them, typically most women in Gee's Bend do not give titles to the quilts beyond describing the colors and patterns such as housetop, bricklayer, strip quilt, etc. However, when Mary Lee began working in the fine art medium of quilt making, she and her fellow artists were asked by the Paulson Press to title their prints. Mary Lee almost always chooses a title that honors those that taught and influenced her quilt making. Here
On her first visit to Paulson Press in 2005, Mary Lee created this etching, which she titled Mama's Song. She originally titled the print Piano Keys before deciding to dedicate the work to her mother, Iola. The musical characteristic of the related quilt design expressed through the black and white bricklayer variation resonated with Mary Lee, for it reminded her of her mother, who loved music as well as singing. In doing so, Mary Lee chose to refer to the legacy of her predecessors as a source of her own success in the fame of the Gee's Bend women and their quilts. As the artist has said, Mama's taught us how. Now we pray that our children can take a pattern from us and do greater things than we are doing. Another one of Mary Lee's prints that is about her connection to people is to honor Mr. Dial. In his work, also created at Paulson Press in 2005, Mary Lee wanted to acknowledge the perspective and friendship given to her by Thornton Dial, a self-taught artist from rural Emmel, Alabama. Mary Lee met Mr. Dial through Bill, Paul, and Matt Arnett, historians and art collectors from Atlanta, who worked closely with both artists. And Mary Lee had once believed that the scraps, such as the tough hems, waistbands, and belt loops left over from the old clothing used in her quilts were unusable materials for a quilt top. However, Thornton Dial didn't see it this way. And to demonstrate this to Mary Lee, he created one of his characteristic relief paintings made of assemblage of scrap clothing and paint, which he titled Mrs. Bendoff. As Mary Lee explains about her print, Mr. Dial did that beautiful piece about me, and I want to honor him. He is such a kind man. I want this piece to honor Mr. Dial. Mary Lee dedicates her works to her friends and elders because she feels she has only them to thank for her skills bestowed upon her and therefore her success in the art world. Within these pieces, one can see the respect and honor Mary Lee attributes to those that came before her. And with that, we hope that there are coming generations to follow in her footsteps. Thank you.
Member of the younger generation of Gee's Bend quilters. She grew up in a household family. Her mother, her great-grandparents, and her siblings. Her childhood was a hard one. She and her siblings had to work in the fields for most of the years, only able to go to school on rainy days, and for a few weeks in the winter until she was 16 and able to go to school full-time. She quilted with her mother, aunt, and great-grandmother as a child and made her first quilt, a housetop made from leftover scraps of her family's clothes, when she was only 12 years old. That year was the same year her brother Christopher was born, and the same year that her great-grandparents, Annie E. Petaway, passed away. Louisiana remembered her devastation as the hearse pulled up to the house, long and black, and carried her great-grandmother away. When Louisiana was able to go to school full-time, she also learned how to quilt from patterns in her home economics class. She always liked the ones she made using her own variations in color and design the best. In addition to making large quilts, she made baby quilts for her siblings when they were born. After Louisiana turned 19, she had a baby of her own and became a single mother, something she had hoped would never happen to her. She got married to her daughter's father a year later and moved away from Gee's Bend to Mobile, Alabama. There she made very few quilts because they weren't necessary. Her family lived in an apartment that was too small to leave much room for pieces of quilts, and had central heating. She worked other jobs to support her growing family, and by 1997 had 3 more daughters and a granddaughter. In 2002, her mother invited her to go to Houston, Texas to see the Quilts of Gee's Bend exhibit opening. This was the first Louisiana had heard of it, and she didn't know what to expect. When she arrived, she was touched to find herself included among the other quilters of Gee's Bend, despite having moved away. And she was stunned when she saw for the first time a piece of a quilt she had made in a book with her name next to it. When she saw her deceased great-grandmother's quilt hanging in the exhibit, Louisiana cried, saying later in an interview, "It felt like in spirit she was there, with her quilt and with me." On the bus ride home from the exhibit, she started imagining designs for new quilts. She ignored these visions at first, thinking that part of her life was over, but they did not go away. She drew them out on paper to alleviate the urge, but eventually gave in, bought fabric, and began making quilts again. Here she diverged from Gee's Bend's traditions by making new fabric instead of old clothing or scrap material preferred by the new to the old. Occasionally, however, she will return to the custom of using older used fabric. Her new quilts are unlike anything else she has seen. Although they are mostly variations of her first quilt, the housetop, Sometimes she makes quilts based on designs that her daughter and granddaughter draw on paper. When she is in the process of making the quilts, she improvises the whole time. She will start the quilt, look at it, put it away, or cut it up and make it into something else, using her intuition and her creative and aesthetic taste to create a plan or pattern. If you really look at them, Louisiana said, when asked about her newer works, they are still based on a housetop. They're a new generation of housetop. Louisiana went to Paulson Press with her mother-in-law, Mary Lee Bendolph, in California in 2005 and 2007 to make prints of her work. There, she had the opportunity to be in charge of people for the first time in her life and make all the decisions, which was, according to her, scary but good. When she put on an old denim apron, it made her feel like an artist and reminded her of the old clothes her family made quilts of. She thought of her granddaughter's drawing designs on paper, designs that she made into quilts, and how now she was making quilts that would be put onto paper. Louisiana wrote, "The whole thing was overwhelming and made me feel such a strong connection back to my family and home." Louisiana continues to work and live in Mobile, Alabama.
Hi, I'm Maddie, and I'm going to talk about the design aspect of Louisiana Bendolph's quilts. So, as you heard, Louisiana Bendolph is a new generation Gee's Bend quilt maker, which means she was raised in the tradition of Gee's Bend, but now draws upon her experiences living and working outside the community. When Louisiana moved to Mobile from Gee's Bend and lived with central heating, she thought of quilt making as an unnecessary task best left in her past. But in 2002, after seeing the original exhibition of Gee's Bend quilts at the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, Louisiana saw quilts in a new way. She decided to take up quilt making once more, now not out of necessity, but for artistic expression, and to continue her family and community's tradition. So Bendolph is best known for her focus on reimagining the housetop quilt design. So the housetop is a Gee's Bend variation on the traditional American quilt pattern known as the log cabin. So that's like a textbook log cabin kind of thing. And on the right, you'll see a traditional Gee's Bend housetop, which takes the same method of piecing a quilt and uses more improvisation. So it's an arrangement of rectangles pieced together in a concentric pattern. And a Gee's Bend housetop is strikingly different from a log cabin design from a quilting book. First, the materials and method are improvisational. Gee's Bend quilt makers piece quilts without measurements or patterns, traditionally. Second, Gee's Bend quilt makers geometrically alter the standard quilt designs from subtly shifting to completely dissolving the basic geometric shapes. For example, in the image on the right, the quilt maker has created a housetop themed medallion in the center of the larger housetop form. In the exhibition, there will be multiple examples of quilts and prints that depict housetop variations. So in creating her innovative works, Louisiana is extending a Gee's Bend legacy of improvising from standard quilt designs. However, Louisiana's redesigning of the housetop goes beyond the tradition of Gee's Bend improvisation. Louisiana breaks down the meaning of a housetop to its bare bones and rebuilds it in her own way using color and space. In almost every Louisiana Bendolph quilt, one can see the suggestion of a housetop form, so even the one on the right would be considered a housetop variation. In interviews, Louisiana states, "I never really thought about housetops as my favorite, but they always start out that way." So in her blue and pink housetop variation, which is going to be in the show in Holden, she breaks down the housetop into an almost pixelated collage of strips. The pink forms a square that shifts in front of and then behind the blue-grays of the denim. This is a great example of Louisiana's playfulness regarding negative space and figure ground reversal. In contrast to the work of fellow quilt makers Mary Lee Bendolph and Loretta Petway, who who both place a strong focus on the life of the fabric before it becomes a quilt and choose to create quilts from well-used clothing, Louisiana uses mostly unused fabrics of the same weight and texture. So she's creating a flat surface and focusing on the arrangement of the colors and the geometric shapes of her quilt designs. Also, while traditionally G's Bend quilters choose to piece quilts on the spot without a design, Louisiana's method often originates with a drawn study on paper before moving on to fabric. So, since 2005, Louisiana has translated her housetop designs into the art of printmaking. In the exhibition are the etchings, this is called At My Mother's Knee, and then this one is Mayday, this one is Shared Legacy, Look Underneath, and Doorway to a Dream. I'm going to stick it on that one because I like it. They're all mostly they were completed in 2013, but she's been a few times. She's been in 2005 and 2007. She's been to Paulson Press in Berkeley. So as we've seen, Louisiana quilts using negative space and blocks of color in a graphic way. So her quilts seem ready-made and easily lend themselves to printmaking. The flatness of her quilt designs seem ready-made for translation to prints, and the prints have the same quality of housetop improvisation as a Louisiana Bendoff quilt. So in conclusion, Louisiana Bendoff's work perfectly embodies the theme of our exhibition, which is the translation of quilts to prints. Her new generation quilt maker identity brings a revival of old traditions while also extending beyond tradition to new innovations. By focusing on design and applying it to printmaking, Louisiana is asserting the artistic value of the G's Bend quilts and opening them up to a new range of possibilities within and without the G's Bend tradition. Thank you.
So thank you everyone for those fabulous presentations. It's about 12:07, so we have some time for questions. People want to ask questions, direct them to the presenters or other people in the classes. Yeah.
At one point, somebody said something about the Scottsboro boys. Who was in?
They were a group of young African American boys in Alabama who were legally lynched, and their mothers spoke out against the craziness that was for something that was in the early 1900s, that was still legal to do something like that.
They were accused of raping two white young women on a train, and there was no evidence beyond there was no evidence that it happened, but they were all convicted anyway. It's in 1931. And the piece that Devin read that she was kind of pulling in there is, it was in Alabama, it was not that far from G's Bend, and the Communist Party got very publicly involved in defending them, in paying for their legal defense. Over the course of the 50s and I think maybe in the early 60s, they all 9 eventually have their convictions overturned, but they are all convicted on basically no evidence in 1931 and the Communist Party is very involved in bringing their mothers forward and having to talk about it.
You mentioned the exhibition of the quilts in Houston. When was that? What museum was that? And how important was that to sort of giving a national profile to the quilts? Was there a precedent to that, or was that through national?
Well, so the exhibition, the original exhibition was called G's Bend, the Women in Their Quilts, and it opened in 2002 at the Houston Museum of Fine Arts. It was organized by the Arnett's and the director and curatorial team at the Houston. That was really the first major exhibition of the quilts. The quilts were known here and there, as I said, kind of in time at different moments, particularly through the Freedom Quilting Bee in the 1960s. It actually, I mean, it opened and closed, I think, without too much fanfare. There was actually reviews that really sort of said, oh, this is the end of the museum, you know, they're going to put quilts in the museum, and now museums are going to have to worry about bed bugs. Good God, you know. And there was actually kind of derogatory comments within the art world about it. But then it traveled to the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, which is a major museum of modern and contemporary art. And it opened there, I think, in early 2003. And when the New York Times art critic at the time, Michael Kimmelman, wrote a review in which he basically said something like, these are the greatest, some of the greatest works of modern art ever created, you know, could stand alongside Picasso, Klee, Kandinsky. People took notice then. And so from there, I think they added more venues. It probably traveled to 10 other museums around the country. I think they toured in Japan. In 2003 or 4, the U.S. Stamps came out with an American Heritage series on the Gee's Bend quilts, and so they were featured on a set of stamps. And it just kind of went from there. And there's been about 3 or 4 other really big exhibitions. I think our exhibition may be the first fairly big exhibition not organized by the Arnett's, which is kind of an interesting thing because the Arnett's in Houston have really sort of kept a pretty tight hold on this material and their interpretation of the material. They've been incredibly generous to us in lending us work and being very supportive of it. But I think it's going to be very interesting in that way because we're sort of giving it our own interpretation. And as I said, it's work that's been done really since all this fame. So, you know, when the exhibition first happened, you know, as you heard in these presentations, they were used to seeing these quilts in their community, in their homes, and not on the walls of museums. And now they really kind of have taken on the role of professional artists. Every one of the quilt makers in our exhibition, they all sell their works between $10,000 and $25,000 or $30,000. Some of them are represented by galleries around the country. Their prints have been shown within the U.S. Embassy program. Their prints are also sold between $3,000 and $5,000. So these are, you know, these are established works in the art world now. So we're sort of also exploring what does that mean as well, and then how do these works now connect back to that tradition. Well, thank you very much for coming. Thanks to all the hard work that
my class who presented.